Now moving on to the rest of today's news, and it was a mad scramble down in Canberra yesterday, but Anthony Albanese is celebrating the end of a parliamentary sitting year on a high note, he thinks, after ramming 31 bills through the upper house. Senators sat till near 11:30pm last night after Labor struck a deal with the Greens to pass a guillotine motion. Parliament did some overtime this morning to officially pass through the mass legislation, so let's now bring in MP Julian Leeser. So lovely to see you, Julian, as always. 30 plus bills. Is this an affront to the parliamentary process, do you think?
I think it is, Erin. I mean, this was a government that promised more transparency and talked a lot about proper process before it was elected. And yet it's clearly mismanaged the parliament by needing to do a special deal with the Greens to change the rules by which we debate legislation in parliament. I mean, I think if you ever wanted a signal of what a Labor-Greens government might actually do, there'd be less transparency, there'd be more dodgy deals, there'd be more ramming through of this legislation. And you have to ask, how were these bills properly considered given the lateness of the sitting? I mean, this government's been in power almost 3 years, but all they're doing is clearing the decks for an early election.
Julian, he looked really pleased with himself, the Prime Minister, this morning, and I'm sure to a degree he is, but surely he knows we're not silly, in that surely he knows that Australians understand what has had to occur for him to get this stuff through. So stuff he's going to use to try and win another election. But we know what we've had to give up for it.
I think you're right, Erin. I think Australians appreciate proper processes, and Australians will look upon this thinking, well, why can't the Parliament actually properly consider legislation? Again and again in this Parliament, we've seen sham committee exercises where the government has been in a rush to get its legislation done, where it hasn't allowed for proper consideration. And often when it has been subjected to consideration, you've seen from interest groups, you've seen from experts that some of the government's proposals in a whole range of areas have not been in the national interest. And that's why they're so quick to try and push these bills through in the dark of night.
Is there a real feel amongst your side that you've got a real chance coming up here? Do you feel more and more, not confident, I'm sure that's not where you're at, but optimistic?
Well, look, Erin, I think Peter Dutton has a job of leading our team. He's provided very strong and consistent leadership. And I think most Australians, when they look at where they were in May 2022 and they look at how life is today, almost everyone is worse off than they were. I think the only people who are better off are some of the union leaders. But, the cost of everything's gone up, whether it's grocery bills, energy bills, gas bills, whether it is the cost of, issues that confront families. Families are having to make choices in my electorate they've never had to make before, whether to put the kids into the local sports team or to buy a new pair of shoes. Families are really being squeezed, and this government has no answers. In fact, everything that they've done is making life harder for families and reducing the productivity of people. So I think as people look at that, as they look at the lawlessness on our streets, the question for people is, do they want 3 more years of this? Do they want to risk having a Labor, Greens, Teals minority government? Or do they want to have a government led by Peter Dutton that will put Australia back on track? And I think at this election, Australians will vote for a government that will put Australia back on track.
But Julian, the Prime Minister said this morning that he's got our backs.
Well, I don't think the Prime Minister's had anybody's back at any time. I mean, if he had our backs, he'd be fully focused on reducing the cost of living. He'd be engaging in orthodox economic policy, which means reducing amounts of government spending. It means increasing productivity by removing some of the job-destroying industrial relations laws that they've brought about. It'd be about actually dealing with some of the lawlessness in the streets and the anti-Semitism that you quite rightly talked about in your editorial this evening. This is what Australians want to see the government deal with, not pet projects that the government was very keen to slam through, which will make Australians worse off.